we have a government here that seems content with spending our money and enacting a situation that involves, people just being turned into a meat grinder somewhere in a Ukrainian field, without any clear plan to actually end this. So we've had Russia, we've had China, and we've had Iran really as the major player in that region. Is there the potential of a formal axis being joined there against the United States and loosely speaking, I suppose, against countries like Britain and European nations, and that ultimately being what World War III is? Hello and welcome to GBN Originals with me, Patrick Christys. Are we sleepwalking towards World War III? It feels as though if you threw a dart at the map of the world at the moment, you unfortunately would find a devastating conflict zone. People had high hopes that some of the issues in the Middle East and in Europe as well, when it comes to Ukraine and Russia, might have been sorted by now, but alas, they do trudge on. So, this is a perfect time, I think, to be introducing such an expert as Dave Decamp from antiwar.com to get stuck into whether or not we really are staring down the barrel, or should that be the hot white nuclear flash of World War III. Dave, thank you very much for joining us today. I think we probably should start closest to home, at least where I am anyway, which is the ongoing issue in Ukraine. So, we were hoping that maybe Trump would have sorted this out on day one. Of course, that was slightly fanciful, but now it appears that this situation is rumbling on. How volatile is it? Just a couple of days ago, Putin just willingly just bombed a massive civilian area in Sumy.
Yeah, it is really unfortunate that this horrific war continues. When President Trump campaigned, he promised to end it in 24 hours. And of course, nobody really expected that to happen. But, it's been a long time now that he's been in office. And we see very heavy fighting along the Eastern Front, very heavy Russian missile strikes across Ukraine. And Ukraine is still firing lots of drones into Russia every day. So things are still very volatile. I think, the one bright spot here, one thing that Trump's doing that was a big break from President Biden is the fact that he's talking with the Russians. And I do think that makes the chance of this thing turning into World War III much less likely, because it was really, Biden really brought us to the brink. And he actually admitted himself back in 2022 that there was a higher risk for nuclear war than any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, how was the Cuban Missile Crisis resolved? They got on the phone and talked to each other. So Biden, ramped up this proxy war and also cut off essentially all high-level contact with the Russians. So it was a very dangerous time. So I think the fact now that we're seeing some genuine effort from the U.S. to do some diplomacy with Russia really does bring things down.
Do you think that Trump doesn't get enough credit for that, Dave? The fact that now, because there is very direct communication between the Russian top brass and the US top brass, actually it does mean that nuclear war is at its lowest potential risk for years.
No, I believe he does deserve credit for that. Because, this was always the way the US and Russia and the US and the Soviet Union operated. They made sure that they had a phone that they could, call the Kremlin, call the White House to cool things down. And Biden ended that. After Russia invaded for 3 years, he didn't have one call with Putin. And his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who's supposed to be the top diplomat in the U.S., didn't speak with his Russian counterpart, except for briefly they talked about a prisoner exchange. So it was really kind of unprecedented what he did. So the fact that the messaging from the Trump administration, too, is that they want to bring this war to an end. The messaging from Biden was that we're going to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. And they had no clear goals. Nobody knew how they were going to do that. So this change, I think, is positive. But again, now we're in a situation where Russia seems perfectly happy to keep this war going until they get what they want. So to end the war, Ukraine is going to have to make some serious territorial concessions when it comes to NATO. And then to get your country into the mix here, you have Starmer and Macron and some other leaders in Europe. They keep holding these meetings talking about sending troops to Ukraine, which that is just a complete non-starter for Russia. And Russia's been very clear that they're not going to accept anything like that. So I think that is actually impeding the peace process here, because one thing Trump wants to do is let the Europeans kind of take more of a lead. Well, what are they doing? They're meeting to send troops to Ukraine.
I'm glad that you've raised that, because it appears to me that our politicians, for decades, by the way, have led us in Britain with a series of catchphrases that have never actually turned out to mean anything, like stop the boats or whatever, or Brexit means Brexit. Just this guff that we've had. And now we're kind of getting something similar here when it comes to Ukraine. Putin must not win. Well, okay, but practically speaking, what does that mean? Because, Trump is clearly trying to end the war. Now, that might not be to everyone's satisfaction. It clearly is not going to be to Zelensky's entire satisfaction. We know that much. But into that void appears to have come a ready political army of leaders like Macron, like Starmer, who, from where I'm sitting, seem to be doing everything they can to prolong this war.
Yeah. And again, when they're talking about sending troops, people might want to debate this, but the fact is one of Russia's main motives for invading Ukraine was its alignment with NATO and its potential to join NATO. And when there were negotiations very early on in March and April 2022, and we've heard this from the Ukrainian side, that Russia's main demand then was for Ukraine to be neutral. And then Russia would have withdrawn under this potential peace deal that was on the table. There was other details that needed to be worked out, but that was the crux of it. Ukrainian neutrality. And what I think should be the biggest scandal of Joe Biden's presidency is the fact that the US and the UK and other NATO countries discouraged those peace talks early on and said, no, don't worry, Zelensky. We're going to fund this whole thing. We'll give you all these weapons. You have to fight. Boris Johnson, as I'm sure a lot of people are aware at this point, went over to Ukraine in April 2022 and told Zelensky not to negotiate, that they want to keep fighting. And we've had confirmation from all sides now, from Ukrainian, from Russia, from Turkey, who hosted the talks in Istanbul, from U.S. officials, that, the U.S. and its allies said, no, you shouldn't make a deal, let's fight. Now, would it have been the fairest deal to Ukraine? No. Did they have reasons not to trust Russia, not to sign a deal? Of course. But them whispering in Ukraine's ear and saying, we're going to give you tens of billions of dollars in weapons, we're going to fund this whole thing, that made it much more likely for them not to sign a deal with Russia. And now here we are years later, and the Russian demands have increased. Now it's not just Ukrainian neutrality. It's also this territory that they've claimed to have annexed. And it goes beyond actually what they occupy. It's the 4 oblasts. So they want the whole territory. So, and now they're dragging this out.
A potent combination of some leaders that you've just mentioned there, and now the latest one, of course, is Keir Starmer, who appears absolutely content for British taxpayers to be funding something in more ways than one, because our energy bills, we've got the highest energy bills in Western civilization, or arguably the world, I think, actually, here in Britain, which is nuts. And we're also gambling with other people's lives. So, we have a government here that seems content with spending our money and enacting a situation that involves, people just being turned into a meat grinder somewhere in a Ukrainian field, without any clear plan to actually end this. It doesn't really seem like the responsible thing to do. But just whizzing ourselves over to a different part of the world now, because for years, decades, we've been told about the coming war with China. And it does appear as though maybe that's getting closer. I'd be keen to get your views on this. Taiwan is a big problem. Taiwan is a big issue. And, there's this trade war situation going on now. How volatile is China? How much of a threat is that, do you think?
Yeah, as you mentioned, we've been hearing about this for a long time, this coming war with China, but it is still hard to actually imagine this turning into a hot war. But there's two things going on between the U.S. and China kind of separately. And one of them has been going on for a long time without getting much attention. And that's kind of this U.S. military buildup in the Asia Pacific, and China, their activity in the South China Sea. The U.S. has increased support for Taiwan in recent years, both militarily and diplomatic support. And of course, that is the most sensitive area for China. And China's reaction to that has been launching these major military drills. They do these drills simulating blockades now. And if you look at what the Pentagon, what the U.S. military is saying, their official policy right now is to prepare for war with China. And again, this is something that with the trade relationship between the U.S. and China, how intertwined their economies are, it was always kind of hard to imagine. But now we see this the trade war that Trump started in his first term, that Joe Biden did continue, which a lot of people don't understand, that he kept all the tariffs on and increased some sanctions. And now Trump has really taken that to another level. So this kind of economic decoupling seems like it's going to happen faster. And, whatever people think of that, the fact is that does make war between these two nuclear powers more likely. And it's something to keep in mind that I think a lot of people are unaware of, is kind of the tensions in the South China Sea, the U.S. deploying these new missile systems to the Philippines, and just a lot of that kind of going on in the background.
Do you think that there's a sense from the Trump regime that some kind of war with China is almost inevitable, and that we might as well get the economic uncoupling out of the way now before it kicks off?
Using the internet without a VPN, a virtual private network, is a bit like taking to the road without car insurance. All it takes is one unlucky moment to cost you a lot of cash. This video's sponsor is Private Internet Access. They are the VPN to help keep you safe. Click the link in the description below to find out why over 30 million people have downloaded PIA to protect themselves online. A virtual private network is an app that hides your IP address and helps keep your data private. When you're browsing the internet at home, you give up a large amount of data to businesses, to shops, and indeed to social media giants too. Hackers have the ability to steal your personal data with ease, including sensitive information such as passwords, keystrokes, and even your personal photos. Private Internet Access helps protect your personal data by encrypting your internet connection to keep your data out of the hands of cyber criminals. And it's not just hackers either to be concerned about. Information can be censored too. When Canada passed their C-18 bill, social media giants decided to ban news content on their platforms. But PIA can protect your ability to consume the news and content you love. Private Internet Access is available for Windows users, Mac OS, Android, Linux, iOS, and you can use one PIA subscription to protect an unlimited amount of devices. And we've got a huge GB News discount for you too. Click the link in this video's description and you'll get a massive 83% off PIA. That's under £2 a month, the price of a coffee, and you'll get an extra 4 months completely free on top. Also, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee too. Visit piavpn.com/GB News to start protecting yourself digitally today.
Yeah, I do think that's a big part of it, because a lot of members of the Trump administration, are about as hawkish on China as you get. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, Mike Waltz, his national security advisor, and even the ones who I like more, who are less hawkish on, say, Russia, kind of their whole thing is that we should give less weapons to Ukraine, wind that down, be less involved in the Middle East so we could focus on this war with China. And it's actually the rhetoric from U.S. military leaders, from U.S. generals in the Asia Pacific that has kind of concerned me the most, because they say things like, oh, we're preparing to fight and win a war with China. And they do say, this is what they say publicly. They say war is not inevitable, but we have to prepare for it. But I do think that is the view, is that some kind of war, and I believe they think it could be limited to like a naval battle over Taiwan or in the South China Sea. But when we're talking about two countries, China doesn't have the nuclear arsenal Russia has, but we're talking about two countries with nuclear weapons. Yeah,
well, we are. And also as well, it's very difficult, I think, for people in the West to get into the mindset of the Chinese rulers for a variety of different reasons. But we did have a little insight of it when we were in the process of making concessions over Hong Kong. And the Chinese response, when they basically, as I understand it, kind of broke a bit of a treaty that we had there and put a few more boots on the ground than maybe they should have done. Their response was to come on the British media and say, if you want a war with China, then you can have one. And we absolutely weren't saying we wanted a war with China. We just said, oh, well, we've got a treaty here that we thought maybe you'd stick to, and then you're not stuck to it. If you want a war with China, you think, gosh, if they really are that aggressive, then I don't see how the US and China can have a limited war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I think the way people should try to understand China, my limited understanding of them is, a lot of people view them as, think of them as communists, which of course they have a communist government. It's part of their rhetoric, but they should be thought of more as nationalists. And, a big part of their whole thing, the whole idea of what the Chinese government is trying to do now is to make themselves, a respectable world power and undo what they call the century of humiliation from the Opium Wars to the to the time that Mao took over at the end of the Chinese Civil War. And, what is that all about? That's all about pushing back against what they view as Western imperialism, again, starting with the Opium Wars and other things that happened after that. So when you have kind of the U.S. in the most sensitive part and the U.K., when we're talking about Hong Kong, in these most sensitive areas for them, we're going to see, them push back hard. And so, this has to be taken into account. Like it's is it totally fair what they're going to do to Taiwan potentially, or what they've done in Hong Kong? No, but you have to look at it. Same thing with Russia. Approach these things with realistic expectations. How much power could the U.S. really defend Taiwan? I don't think so. I think all the war games show that thousands of U.S. sailors on Navy ships would be killed in the first week of a battle. And we have to keep this in mind. And to avoid war, the U.S. and the West is going to have to cede some of that influence to China in these most sensitive areas, Taiwan and the South China Sea. And then from there, you could lay down some red lines, because you have one thing that China has to deal with is all these countries, Japan, the Philippines, India, that they don't want any Chinese expansion in the region, and they can all work together. So it's just going to take, I think, logic and understanding of China's red lines.
And so sorry to go across, but because I think as well that there's an increasing attitude. I think maybe technology has done this. On your smartphone, online, you're more able to access video footage from war zones, etc. I think a lot of people in Britain are asking themselves, do I want to die for Ukraine? And I think a lot of people are saying no. I think they say it's not. We don't like what's going on over there. We don't like the way Putin's behaved. We don't like the idea of it. And if he did that in Britain, if Putin just decided to invade and feel that he wanted to take control of Yorkshire, then I imagine we would all feel like fighting to the death for that. But that's not what's happening. I wonder how many US citizens are willing to die for Taiwan. And we'll have to wait and see how that plans out. Is there another issue with China, just before we move on to a bit about the Middle East, is there another issue with China, which is their population, which I imagine that the psychology of your average Chinese citizen is that if the government tells you that you do have to fight to the death against the Western imperialists, then they will be quite happy to pick up arms, which might not necessarily be the same about some of those Western countries, like here in Britain or Europeans.
Yeah, no, that's true. And, I do believe that in the West, they kind of have this idea about Chinese citizens that they're kind of yearning to be free of this communist rule that they're under. But if you go to China and, you see they have a big middle class that is living much better than they have, in the past few decades. And as I understand them, again, limited knowledge, I've been to China and I know, I have some understanding of it. In the face of a foreign power being aggressive or perceiving it as aggression, they're going to be, rally around their government and be willing to take up arms if it does come to that, I believe.
Let's hit another flashpoint now. I mean, the Middle East as a whole, really, but I suppose we've got what's going on in Gaza. There's been a bombing offensive in Yemen. There's the involvement of Iran in all of this as well. How do you see that playing out for the Trump administration, really? What kind of potential escalation or otherwise could that look like in the next couple of years or few years?
Yeah, well, the big thing right now is how these negotiations with Iran are going to go, because the Trump administration, they just started negotiations over Iran's nuclear program. And essentially, a deal is possible, which would really ease tensions between the U.S. and Iran and make war much less likely if the U.S. kind of has a narrow focus, basically going back to the Iran deal that Trump got out of in 2018. Under that deal, it kept Iran's nuclear enrichment very low. But you have kind of the neocons in the Trump administration, the real Iran hawks, which there's a lot of them, very influential positions in the U.S. in Congress, who, they want to demand Iran completely dismantle its nuclear program, limit its ballistic missiles, and that's just, Iran's just not going to do that. So right now, it does seem like there's kind of an internal struggle in the administration between people who do not want another big war in the Middle East and these like super Iran hawks. And the other area for escalation, I mean, Trump is threatening to bomb Iran basically if these negotiations don't work out. And a lot of people think this could just be limited. But the fact is, Iran does have some very advanced missiles, and there's a lot of American bases in the region. And I believe the Pentagon, the war games say that there could be thousands of U.S. casualties if Iran really unleashes its missiles. And then what happens? Where do things go from there? And could be another huge destabilizing war in the region, which means more migration. The people in Europe and the UK are the ones who get the brunt of that aspect of it. So it's a very dangerous time with Iran. And the other escalation that seems to be is the war in Yemen, which the U.S. began bombing Yemen again a month ago. And President Trump acts like this is this big new idea that he had to bomb Yemen to try to solve the problem there. But the U.S. has been bombing Yemen for years. And he during his first term, he backed a very brutal Saudi war against the Houthis, who they're currently bombing. And the Houthis came out on top. They're very resilient. They've essentially been asking for this, for a direct war with the U.S., and you can't just bomb them away. The root cause of the issues in the Red Sea right now is what's happening in Gaza. When there was a ceasefire, the Houthis stopped their attacks. And right now, there was a ceasefire deal that Israel completely blew up. And all of the hostage families, even the Israelis who were held hostage in Gaza, are saying that they want Israel to implement that full ceasefire deal because it will free all the hostages. But Israel, the Netanyahu government's just on this tear. And they just yesterday, who knows exactly how true this is, but Hamas said that they lost contact with the group guarding one of the hostages, the one who actually has American citizenship. I mean, a bombing campaign is not a way to safely return captives. And the fact is, if Gaza calms down, then the whole region will calm down. So that's really kind of key to all of this.
I hear all of that. At the same time, I must say I do have a huge amount of sympathy for people who are in favour, essentially, of Israel really going all out to just absolutely ruin Hamas in any way they possibly can. And unfortunately, and I'm not saying I am in favour of the loss of civilian life before anyone jumps all over this quote, but unfortunately the way that Hamas operates and the nature of that particular battlefield and that war zone, and there's very fine blurred lines between people who are genuine civilians and people who actually occasionally pick up a weapon and fight for Hamas. It does make it incredibly difficult. But just to try to bring all of this together, the topics that we spoke about earlier. So we've had Russia, we've had China, and we've had Iran really as the major player in that region. Is there the potential of a formal axis being joined there against the United States and loosely speaking, I suppose, against countries like Britain and European nations, and that ultimately being what World War III is?
I think, there's a possibility of events leading to that. And I think that possibility is basically if the war in Ukraine is not settled and things explode over Taiwan, then, we could end up in that situation and Iran would be allied with Russia and China. On the other hand, if the U.S. does start bombing Iran, I don't see Russia coming to their defense. I see the potential for Russia, supplying them with weapons and things like that. But I don't see a Middle East war, I mean, as disastrous as it would be, a new big one, turning into World War III. I mean, I think China's attitude toward the Middle East is kind of just let the U.S. get bogged down there more. I mean, they're wasting all these munitions on Yemen. There's reports that the China hawks in the Trump administration are worried that they're using too many missiles on Yemen because they want to send them over to near China. So I don't see the Middle East war leading to the World War III. But again, if all these things kind of just go on this trajectory that we're on, like we need real peace efforts all over and people to kind of start thinking more instead of just pumping. In the U.S. here, we have this military industrial complex that just drives everything. Trump is making cuts to government spending in certain places, but he's also bragging about how he's going to approve $1 trillion Pentagon budget, the biggest one ever. And it's just this machine that as you feed it, it just grows and expands. And these are the people who benefited from the Ukraine war. And this is just kind of, we really need a change in the U.S., the way that we look at our foreign policy and our wars. And it's just, we're on this very dangerous trajectory, I think.
Yeah, I also think if I was, Putin or Xi Jinping or whoever the Ayatollah, heaven forbid, but then I would potentially be looking at the West now and thinking that it's been quite fractured for a while, whether it's been continental Europe, I'm in favour of Brexit. I'm not in favour of the way it's been implemented, but the way that's gone about. I think the way that they've reacted to the United States. I also think the way that, unfortunately, I think you might have alluded to this earlier on as well, with mass immigration into Europe, especially illegal immigration, rapid cultural changes there. They do have an impact on societal cohesion. And if you were deciding to think about attacking the West, really, well, how unified are European countries now, really, and how behind their own leaders are they? But I think that's a topic for another time. Dave, thank you very much for today. I've really appreciated it, and we covered a lot of ground there. I hope to talk to you again very soon. I mean, maybe next time. This is wishful thinking, but we might be able to talk about world peace. But I suspect we're going to be waiting a long time for that. So, Dave, thank you very much.
Hopefully.
Dave Decamp there from antiwar.com. You take care. Good man. See you soon.
Thanks, Patrick. I appreciate it.